I think the Liberal Democrats will be very wary of doing a deal with Labour unless they can get PR, because if they get PR, proportional representation, that means that they are players for, cements a certain, representation for forevermore. Now, the interesting thing over the last few days has been that Labour has been moving heavily towards PR, proportional representation. A majority of the constituencies have passed motions. It's been debated at the annual conference several times, and the constituencies are clearly in favour of it. And the unions have been moving in that direction.
Hello and welcome to Reasoned UK with me, Darren Grimes. Please do consider hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell if you enjoy today's content to ensure you don't miss out on all of the latest from me and the team. Now on Thursday, 4th of May, the nation went to the polls. Councils representing 7 in 10 people in England have been up for grabs in what is viewed as the biggest test at the ballot box yet for both Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer and, of course, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Now, at the time of recording, the Conservatives have lost more than 1,000 seats in these local elections. That's actually worse than the expectation management exercise that politicians often undertake before an election to actually do a bit of party management on saying just how bad it's going to be so they can turn around and say, well, it hasn't been as bad as X. Frankly, it has been as bad as X. We don't have quite the full picture, but the picture we do have ain't happy reading for the Conservative Party. Now, in 2019, the Labour Party, of course, endured its worst general election defeat since 1935, but Conservatives appear to actually be losing votes fastest in the south, not the so-called Red Wall, often in areas actually where the Lib Dems are the main rivals. So what does all this mean? Well, I was scratching my head earlier and I thought of the perfect man. I'm delighted to be joined by the former Channel 4 News and BBC broadcaster, the journalist and author Michael Crick, to take us through what the national picture is actually beginning to tell us. This is a man with encyclopedic knowledge of parties and politics and local election dramas. You name it, he knows it. Hello, Michael. Thank you very much for your time.
Hello, Darren.
Now, Michael, come on, listen, I'm not meaning to sound incredibly impertinent, right? But you've been covering politics and elections for quite some time now. Now, before we actually get into what the local elections tell us, how accurately can you actually be on predicting what's going to happen in a general election from a local election before it? Is there an air of sort of mystic meg about it all?
Well, it's no, not really. I mean, sorry, there is an air of mystic meg, and it's not that accurate a picture. I think if Labour had done really, really badly last night, I think that would be dreadful news for them, and would tell us that their chances of doing well at a general election were pretty slim. But they didn't do badly last night. They did pretty well, but after all, it's only England. Not London, not Wales, it's not Scotland. And there's a long way to go between now and the election. But I mean, in the 1990s, in the run-up to Tony Blair winning the huge landslide of 1997, Labour did really, really well in 3 local elections in a row. So what I would say is that it's a requirement that Labour does well in an opposition party does well in the local elections ahead of a general election, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to win that general election. Now, my own view is that this week on Thursday, the Conservatives did slightly worse than I'd expected. Labour did slightly better than I'd expected, but I stick to what I've been saying for a long time now. I think Keir Starmer will be Prime Minister after the next election, but he will be Prime Minister of a minority government, as has often happened, of course, with Labour governments in the past. And I just think it's too big a hurdle for Starmer and the Labour Party to get an absolute majority in the House of Commons, which requires them to win 125 more seats. And it's a much more difficult task than it was way back in 1997. And I think Labour lacks some of the huge advantages that Tony Blair and New Labour had back then.
So can you explain what some of those are then? Because, a lot of people right now are suggesting that, you look on Twitter, for example, and Tory wipeout is trending on there. I mean, some are depicting an image of the nail in the coffin for the Conservative Party itself. Why are things not looking quite as rosy as they were before 1997, for example?
Well, for a start, I don't think Keir Starmer is in Tony Blair's league as a charismatic, attractive leader that appealed, frankly, to lots of Conservatives. I know all sorts of Conservatives who admit they voted for Blair in 1997 and 2001, and some of them in 2005, simply because, well, frankly, they thought he was one of them. But also, he did have many political skills that Starmer lacks. Starmer is wooden. He lacks warmth. And I think above all, Starmer's problem is we don't really know what he believes in.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Starmer who was elected Labour Party leader back in 2020 after the 2019 defeat was well to the left of the Starmer now and has ditched most of the promises he made, or a lot of the promises he made as a leadership candidate. And one is left thinking, well, even if he makes a new list of promises, can we believe them? So that's one disadvantage, huge disadvantage. Second, I don't think Starmer's team is the caliber of Blair's team. I mean, it wasn't just Blair himself. Gordon Brown was a formidable figure. Robin Cook, Jack Straw, John Prescott. John Prescott had an appeal to areas that the other four didn't. I think it was a really strong team that Blair and Labour had way back in 1997. And then the other point is this: Scotland. And Scotland is the great unknowable. Labour had just one seat in Scotland at the last election. Now, we don't know what effect the troubles, to put it mildly, of the SNP right now are going to have on Labour. But Labour needs a really strong showing in Scotland. Now, before the SNP's troubles, Labour people were talking about gaining 10 seats from Scotland. Well, if you remember way back in the new Labour years, Labour would have 50 plus seats in Scotland. So now it could be that the SNP's problems produce a huge swing to Labour, but I suspect that the SNP's demise will be shared, that all three other opposition parties in Scotland, opposition to the SNP parties, will be devouring the carcass of the SNP, or the limited carcass of the SNP. So in other words, the Conservatives, the Lib Dems and Labour will be picking meat off that carcass. And I still think the SNP will win a decent number of seats at the next general election anyway. And of course, the other problem I think that Starmer has is that there's bound to be a swing back towards I think the government in the next 18 months. Oh, and there's another problem, that the hurdle for success for the Labour Party is a lot more than this time round, because of the Scotland problem, because of the new boundaries, the new constituency boundaries. People were saying before the Scotland problem, the psephologists were saying before the SNP's problems, that Labour needed a 12% lead to get a majority of one seat. A 12% lead, which is huge. I mean, the local election results suggest a 9% lead. And Blair, back in 1997, for all, the landslide and everything, Labour only had a 12.8% lead in 1997. So that just shows how the electoral arithmetic has changed so much in those 26 years. So my view is it will be a Starmer minority government, a Labour minority government. That seems to be borne out by what John Curtis, the foremost psephologist of them all, has been saying, that he doesn't think that the results from Thursday are good enough for a Labour majority government. But hey, I mean, most Labour supporters would have taken that 4 years ago after the worst result, ever really for the Labour Party way back in 2019. They would have taken, a minority government and with just 200 seats or whatever. But the it's so, and of course it then gets really interesting, because Labour will have to get help
Yes,
from
exactly.
one of
Uh,
the other
and that leads
centre
me on.
parties. Yeah,
That leads me on then to saying, what about the help, right? What about the help from the
yeah,
likes of the Lib Dems? Because the Liberal
yeah,
Democrats have taken Michael Gove's local council of Surrey Heath. Now, Michael,
yeah.
they're calling it the Portillo moment of the election. I'm not sure I would go quite that far. I don't know about you, but they're obviously harking back to Michael Portillo losing his seat in what was potentially the biggest shock of the night in 1997. But if Labour get
Yes.
in, as you say, as you predict, in a minority government, and they have to rely on the Lib Dems for support, do we start to see issues like electoral reform popping up again, Michael?
Well, we do,
Yeah.
and that's where it gets really interesting. Um, First of all, we ought to say that if Labour are the biggest party, I don't think there's any way that Sunak. I mean, Sunak will have been perceived to have lost the election. The Conservatives will have perceived to have lost the election, and the only people they can count on for support are, of course, the Democratic Unionists from Northern Ireland. Whereas the other smaller parties in the House, at sort of left of centre. You're talking about the Lib Dems would probably be the second biggest, then the SNP. And then, of course, you've got, maybe, you've got one Green MP at the moment. They might get one or two more, the Welsh Nationalists. And so, Labour could depend on a combination of those. What I would say is this: it does get very interesting in terms of proportional representation. And I think the Liberal Democrats are going to be very wary about joining a coalition government again in the way that they did back in 2010, because coalition governments tend to benefit the big party in the coalition, Conservatives back in 2010, of course, David Cameron, and cause huge damage to the smaller party in the coalition, which of course is what happened. And they were down to 8 seats, weren't they, at
Yeah.
the 2015 election? So, in other words, anything good out of a coalition, the big party gets the credit, and anything bad, the small party gets the blame. And so, and also, I think Liberals and Liberal Democrats will look back at 50 years of sort of deals with other parties. There was the Lib Lab Pact under Labour in the late 70s with Jim Callaghan, where they were promised all sorts of things in government and didn't really get much in the end. So that was a bit of a disappointment. Then, of course, there's the famous pact that Paddy Ashdown made before the 1997 election, a secret pact, the details of which only came out later in Ashdown's diaries, where the deal was that no matter what the election result was, that Tony Blair would bring Liberal Democrats into his government as ministers, that they'd get PR for there'd be a commission on PR and a referendum and all sorts. And in the end, Labour's majority was so big that Blair simply reneged on the deal. So the Liberals and the Liberal Democrats don't have a very happy history of doing deals with other parties. So I think the Liberal Democrats will be very wary of doing a deal with Labour unless they can get PR. Because if they get PR, proportional representation, that means that they are players for, cements a certain representation forevermore. Now, the interesting thing over the last few days has been that Labour has been moving heavily towards PR, proportional representation. A majority of the constituencies have passed motions. It's been debated at the annual conference several times, and the constituencies are clearly in favour of it. And the unions have been moving in that direction. I think partly the constituencies and the unions have been moving in that direction because up until recently they thought, well, we're never going to have another Labour government unless we have PR. Now, of course, they're starting to think, well, we might get another Labour government without PR.
Yes.
But Starmer, the Starmer of broken promises, made it clear about 3 years ago. He sort of made noises to the effect that he supported PR. He's now making noises to the effect he doesn't support PR. Well, if he doesn't support PR and he's not willing to promise that to the Lib Dems, it's going to be much harder to get Lib Dem support for either a coalition or for a confidence and supply agreement. And so there's so many imponderables here. But on the other hand, if a Labour Lib Dem agreement or coalition was to produce proportional representation, and I think there'd have to be a referendum first, but if it was to produce PR, that I think would transform British politics, because
Yeah.
I think what it would mean is there would be a split within the Conservative Party and a split within the Labour Party, and in the Conservatives between and you also get the sort of remnants of Reform UK and UKIP and Farage and that joining a right-wing group with the Conservative right-wingers, and I imagine you'd be part of that. And then there'd be the sort of more centrist type of Conservatives in another party, and the same would happen with Labour. So you'd have at least 5 major politics, well, 6 if you include the Greens. So it would transform British politics. You'd probably see Nigel Farage elected an MP at last, after all his 7 previous attempts. But quite how stable it would be, goodness knows.
Well,
But
that's what I wanted to ask you, actually,
we've
because
covered
you've...
a lot of ground here. Sorry, I've
Yeah,
been
no, not
rambling
at all.
and haven't
I
had
mean,
you to ask any questions.
you've quite literally written the book on Nigel Farage, and quite recently.
Yeah.
When was it published, Michael?
It was published last year,
Last
and the
year.
paperback edition.
It's...
The paperback edition, which I should have
You plugged.
in fact, I've got
Yes,
one behind
absolutely.
me. The paperback edition
The...
was out. The paperback edition
Right, that's
came
it.
out a few weeks ago. I can't get it into the picture, but there we are.
I'll put a
'cause
link.
it's,
I'll put a link to it in the description, because
one fast
undoubtedly,
after another, it's good.
undoubtedly, a lot of
The
Farage
interesting
fans.
thing about- the interesting thing about the Nigel Farage story is that I talked about the secret deal between Ashdown and Blair, and the Blair government was committed to bringing in proportional representation for the European Parliament, because up till then we'd elected our European MPs on a first past the post basis, but the EU, the states of the EU, had sort of agreed that from now on everybody ought to have PR. Labour was willing to go along with this, but they couldn't get it through the House of Lords, because the House of Lords didn't like the method that Labour wanted to introduce. And Blair, under pressure from Jack Straw, who was the minister responsible for the legislation, was quite willing to ditch PR for the European Parliament, because Straw has never liked proportional representation. And whereupon Paddy Ashdown intervened and said, "You can't do that. That would be the end of me. I will lose any credibility with my party if you don't introduce, at least give me something from, the coziness between us." And so, at the last minute, Blair pushed through PR for the European Parliament, and a few weeks later, Nigel Farage was amongst the first 3 UKIP MPs elected. The next time, in 2004, it was up to 12. 2009, it was up to 13, and so on. And of course, it led to eventually the Brexit Party in 2019
Winning the lot.
PR,
Yeah. Well, not the lot, but winning the most.
The biggest party in the European Parliament. So, you could see a sort of repeat of that in a funny way. So it would be good news, I think.
Yeah, well, you've written about that, right? You've written about the formation of the Brexit Party and actually, of course, of UKIP. Now, where do you see them going now? Where do you see, because of course UKIP in these local elections this week have been completely decimated. Now, but actually, though, Michael, they were getting quite big support in areas like Sunderland and other parts of the country. Do you see that support actually going somewhere now, or, has it just gone back to Labour? What's going on with that support?
Well, I think it will. The knee-jerk response of many people would be to say, "Oh, well, it'll go back to the Conservatives." But you and I know that a lot of the support that UKIP got, particularly in its later years, and the Brexit Party got, was disaffected Labour people.
Yeah, they'll never vote Tory as well. Some of them,
Sorry.
Some of them will just never vote Tory.
Yeah, some of them would never vote Conservative, although that is an interesting... I mean, we could discuss that, by the way, because I think that once people have voted Conservative in the red wall areas, it's a lot harder to get them back. And I think the Conservatives would be slightly the main beneficiary. But I've never thought that Reform UK are a serious threat at the next election. I think the basic problem that parties like that now have is that the elections to the European Parliament, as soon as they started being under PR, would give people like UKIP and the Greens and horrendously the BNP a regular injection of votes and rebel votes, really, troublemaker votes. What's the protest votes is the phrase I'm looking for. And then once they got some MEPs elected, that would bring in loads of money because they'd all fiddle the European expenses, as all parties did, frankly, including the main ones, and it gives them status and so on. Well, you haven't got that anymore. So you haven't got the European Parliament elections giving this regular 5-year boost to small parties in British politics, which has gone on now for the last 25 years until we left the EU. And that boosted UKIP, it boosted the Brexit Party, the BNP, the Greens, and the Lib Dems, actually. And that's now gone. So it means that British politics is much more likely to return to, in general elections, I think, much more likely to return to two-party or two-and-a-half-party contests.
Yeah. I mean, on that point then, if Labour do manage to be the biggest party in Parliament, you've been covering via your @Twitter MPs Twitter account the prospective MPs, really. That is people who've been selected to stand for seats. Now, I have to say, this is worthwhile stuff because it's pretty safe to say, Michael, as you well know, that the Tories didn't expect some of the candidates that they put forward to actually win seats in 2019, right? And they were pretty remorseful after some of them actually did. And actually, Labour had examples like Jared O'Mara, of course, who ended up going to court after he was kicked out. Now, what made you actually want to chronicle this journey?
Well, I've always thought that the selection of candidates is one of the areas of politics that's, I suppose it stems from my own ambitions when I was a young man to go into politics myself. And I've always thought it's fascinating how people get to become candidates. That is often the crucial moment in a political career, not the day they're elected MP, but the day they're chosen as a candidate, often for a safe seat, and how difficult it is, and all the fixes and fiddles and accidents and things that go on behind the scenes. And I often used to cover this at the start of general elections when I was working for Newsnight and Channel 4 News, and it's good, interesting stories involving people like Dominic Grieve and Yvette Cooper and so on. And the fiddles that went on. There are always fiddles and fixes. And it's politics in the raw. And it's sort of the equivalent, really, of the American primary process, which, of course, is very public, whereas selections in this country are very secretive, particularly in your party. But the Lib Dems as well, they're pretty secretive. And I thought, right, I'm going to shine the spotlight on this. And in every selection, we're going to say who the contenders are, say a little bit about them, say what the vote is if we can find out, announce it first. And of course, this has irritated the party high commands hugely, which has only stiffened my resolve to carry on with it. It's a huge fun thing to do. The trouble is, it doesn't make me any money. It's a pure hobby, but I love doing it, and it's fascinating. Now, one of the interesting developments is how Starmer and, frankly, his henchmen, I would call them, because they do at times behave like a bunch of gangsters, have they've fixed and fiddled in one or two ways, I think, as well. They've certainly fixed the cohort. I think we've had 122 so far, and the number you could say they're actually on the left, I think, is two people who are proper left wingers. There's Faisal, what's her name?
Faisal Shaheen. Yeah, exactly.
Faisal Shaheen and Pinkford and Chris Webb in Blackpool, and all the rest are Starmerite fodder. Really, they are not likely to rebel, or at least at this stage they don't.
So is this a purge of the momentum lot? Does this hark back, Michael?
Yeah,
because you also chronicled, of course, what happened in Militant as well. Is this harking back to that as well? Is this a repeat of history?
Well, it is, and actually, the people who are doing the fixing for Starmer are the same people who, when the Corbynites were in power, were trying to, behind the scenes, fix selections for the Labour right, and actually were quite successful at it. And Corbyn didn't actually get as many candidates in as you might have expected. It has been a purge, and not just of the left really, but the soft left, I'd say. I mean, I actually believe that if Angela Rayner or Robin Cook or Neil Kinnock or John Prescott were standing for a Labour selection now, they wouldn't be allowed on the long list. They would be the national executive panel that considers the contenders would find something in their past, some bit of controversy, something they'd said on social media, or the fact they'd had a cup of tea with Jeremy Corbyn or something, to purge them from the list, and they've been doing it very successfully. The trouble is, I'm a great believer that if you narrow down your party to a very narrow band of opinion, it's stupid. And I think Liz Truss did that, and I think Boris Johnson did that to a degree as well. I believe that successful political parties have to reflect a wide range of opinion. My politics essentially is pluralism. I like a bit of everything, and I think that is the key to parties, and certainly the Labour Party. If you take the successful Labour governments of Attlee and Wilson and Blair, they all had notable and very able left wingers. I mean, Nye Bevan, obviously, and the Blair government had John Prescott, and you had people like Tony Benn and so on. And Labour has always been a broad church, and if you narrow it down, you lack a range of ideas. You lack people who are willing to come along to cabinet and say, well, actually, does this really make sense? Shouldn't we be doing this? Or shouldn't we be looking at the policy that we put forward in the past or whatever? And then, I think they're making a terrible mistake here and storing up trouble within the party.
You're looking at the Conservative Party, right? A party that houses Michael Heseltine and Sir Bill Cash. The two are, well, perhaps not on economics. On economics, they may be aligned. And me, yeah. That's quite a broad church. I wonder, would electoral reform actually free people from those constraints where actually there could be separate groupings that have to work together more? Or does that mess everything up, Michael, in your view?
Well, I think if we had proper PR and not the alternative vote system that there was a referendum about back in 2011, wasn't it? Then I think inevitably the parties would split. I mean, the left have given up in the Labour Party right now. They don't even apply for selections anymore because they know. I mean, you'll know from your friends who've tried. Going for a selection involves a lot of work.
Yeah.
And a fair bit of money as well, and it's just not worth it if you know that somebody from head office is just going to purge you on the grounds of some tweet you wrote 5 years ago. That it can often be quite mild. I mean, the slightest excuse, and they'll purge you from the list. People on the right, on the Labour right, who'd done the same thing, wouldn't be purged from the list. So I think that there would be a split within the Labour Party, and of course, throwing out Corbyn. And I think they'll be stopping Diane Abbott from contesting the next election as well. That is likely to encourage that. I think some people in the Starmer High Command would probably welcome it if those people left the party and formed another party. But I think if you have PR, then inevitably you would get a group of socialist MPs, a separate socialist party of MPs. As opposed to the sort of Starmer Social Democrats, and I think you'd see the same kind of split in the Conservative Party, and you may even see three-way splits. So it then becomes incredibly messy because after every election you've got to then negotiate, as we see. So in Israel, in Europe, and all these other countries that have PR, and you end up with a government that nobody really expected when they went to the polling booth. So my own personal views on PR, I swing one way. Sometimes I believe in it, and I just I think, well, it is the fairest system. On the other hand, I then think about all the deals that have to go on to construct a government and keep it going as well. And I think, well, maybe not. But
Well, if it does
anyway, who
happen,
cares?
Michael, you're going to need
I think,
another Twitter account. You're going to have to set up another Twitter account if
yeah,
that does actually happen. But I mean, how do you
yeah,
just finally then? How do you see this moving forward? Because politics in Britain, right? We had Brexit, we had the 2019 result, and you've just mentioned there that, once you do something for the first time, it's perhaps habit forming, right? Where you vote
yes,
Conservative for the first time, and perhaps that starts a habit, or you
yes,
feel that you can start to vote for other parties. Because actually,
yes.
Nigel, I believe you argue, actually, Nigel was the catalyst for much of this, really, because people voted for a party that wasn't Labour for the first time, you know?
Yes, and
Um,
I think that's absolutely right. I think that what happened in the red wall seats is that they were presented with alternatives to Labour that weren't Conservative. So they were presented both with the possibility of voting UKIP, which people in those kind of seats really started to in quite a big way in the early teens and up to and in the 2015 election. And then, of course, the other alternative they were presented with was the 2016 Europe referendum, which was another way of sort of voting, as an alternative to Labour, because Labour's official policy was Remain, of course.
mhm.
And I think once you've done it once, and the sky hasn't fallen in, then you start thinking, well, maybe I could vote Conservative next time then. And I think that's what happened in 2019. And I think one of the very interesting stats to look at is, you'll recall in 2017, Labour lost a by-election in Copeland, a seat they'd held, I think, since 1935.
Yeah,
And then
Trudy
at the general
Harrison's seat.
election, that's right. And then at the general election, Labour actually picked up 24 seats, but they lost 5. And they were Walsall, North East Derbyshire, Middlesbrough, Stoke Central, and which Stoke was it? It was one of the Stokes, and there was another one too. So there were 5 of them. And then if you look and these were all seats that Labour had held forever. And and if you look what happened in those seats in 2019, nearly all of them had built massive majorities for the Conservatives, sort of 10, 12,000. And it's almost as if, the dam had burst and people started noticing, God, there's people around here who vote Conservative. Well, maybe it's okay to vote Conservative. And I think that for Labour to get those people back, they can no longer rely on class solidarity. The fact that, my dad always voted Labour, my grandparents always voted Labour, the great grandparents, all the cliches about, turning his grave and all of that. And Labour has got to win those people back, I think, by persuasion. And that's why I am sceptical about whether they will win. They will win some of those seats back, of course. But whether they'll win them all back, I very much doubt. And I think there's evidence in the local elections to that effect. Having said that, Labour will pick up some seats in the south that they've never had before. They're aiming for Wickham, which they haven't had since 1951, and Basingstoke, which I don't think they've ever had, and Worthing, and the 2 Bournemouth seats are on their target list, which Labour's never had either of the Bournemouth seats. So, and of course, there's also the development of the Lib Dems doing well in the home counties.
But will they
Wall,
continue
those
to, though,
seats.
Michael? Will seats in Chesham and Amersham, for example, will they, in a actual general election, where, they're deciding
Yeah,
matters like taxation and all the rest of it,
yeah,
will those quite affluent seats, will they actually continue
yeah.
to support the Lib Dems, do you reckon?
Well, I think some will and some won't. And, I think Dominic Raab's a gunner. And if I were him, I'd step down and leave politics, because I think he's going to lose his seat. And there will be others in the home counties. Chesham and Amersham, who knows? And I think that, some of those people who were voting Lib Dem, some of those Conservatives who started voting Lib Dem because they didn't like Brexit and they didn't like Boris Johnson, we'll start thinking, well, Brexit's, a while ago, we're not going to get it back. And Sunak, they will see as a more centrist politician. So it's a complicated picture.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think the Lib Dems are only going to make gains in the sort of dozens. You're not going to be seeing hundreds of Lib Dems, and most of those gains will be in the southeast. A lot of those gains will be in the southeast. They've got other targets too, but I mean, internally they've only got only about 30 targets, the Lib Dems, and they're very, very tough on making their candidates. You've got to canvass this number of people a week, and you've got to report back and show us that you have. And if you don't, then you stop getting money. And although the Lib Dems do well in local government elections and they do well in parliamentary elections, the polling figures are, still not above 10%. I mean, and they've had both the Greens and Reform UK on their tails. So I think the local results from the last few days probably give the Lib Dems a buoyancy that they don't entirely deserve.
Yes.
I think internally they don't really expect huge gain. They haven't for a while. They're what are they on now? 13, 14. 30 is probably a realistic. 30, maybe 40. I don't know, because the other thing, of course, is you've got more tactical voting than ever. There's almost a pact between Labour and the Lib Dems in lots of places, and you see that in some of the. If you analyse some of the council elections and how the Lib Dems stand in one ward and Labour stands in another, and they very rarely stand against each other in some places. And of course, there was an element of a pact in some of the by-elections earlier in this Parliament. That the deal was that the Lib Dems should concentrate on North Shropshire and Labour will concentrate on the Eltham one. And again, the Lib Dems should concentrate on Cheshire and Amersham, and will concentrate on Batley and Spen. And the party leaders were never seen in the one that they weren't meant to contest. And it was a sort of deal, I think, that was probably never. There was probably never certainly not on paper, and it may not even have been a spoken deal. But it's just that both sides knew what they had to do, and I think. That relationship is, that quiet relationship will affect the election, and there will be more. Tactical voting has become more and more common at virtually every general election. So, it's also unknowable, isn't it? Really,
it's insane. It's insane. But gone are the days of Cleggmania. It's fascinating, yeah. Gone are the days of Cleggmania, but we're about to get a Starmer sandwich, perhaps. So there we are.
I can't see Davy mania. Can you?
No, I can't. I can't.
The other problem with them. I mean, in my lifetime, I was born in 1958, and the Liberal Democrats were incredibly lucky. They didn't have many MPs, but there was always one MP who was, had charisma and stood out. So you had Joe Grimman, Jeremy Thorpe, David Steele, Paddy Ashdown, and then they started Charles Kennedy, of course, and then they started to struggle. And you had Min Campbell, but he was, beyond his time, and so. And now they haven't really got anybody with great charisma. That there are some that people say are up and coming, but they haven't done it yet.
No,
and and without that charisma, Davy is never going to produce Cleggmania that we saw back in 2010. On the other hand, you've got to remember that the Lib Dems actually lost seats in 2010, which is easy to figure.
It is indeed. Anyway, listen, we're going to have to talk about this again because no doubt there's going to be more twists and turns along the way. But as I say, there's a link in the description to the Farage latest in paperback, which everyone will want to check out. But Michael Crick, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Dan.
Have you got what it takes to be a reasoned presenter? Well, send us a short clip of yourself to join@reasoned.uk and we might be seeing you on this very channel very soon indeed.